Good morning. This is Pastor Jeff. It is Sunday, July 31st, 2022, Proper 13, and we just finished our second worship service, so I'm hanging out here in my office and going to give you the sermon for the day. The sermon text was Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 21. Here we go. So the story today is part of the sequence in the teaching of Jesus. He is sharing with the hearers that we need to be ready for the coming judgment. In this story, we hear about wealth and greed. There are multiple passages throughout Luke where he deals with this issue. Today's passage might be one of the most famous. However, Luke is not the only writer that deals with this issue. It can be found throughout the canon. In my experience, when we read this passage and then have Bible study or hear sermons, it deals mostly with the individual who has died, and we do not examine the conversations that Jesus had with the younger man. This morning, I am hoping to touch base on both of them and maybe give you a little bit of an insight on why the younger brother decided to approach Jesus, even though it is very apparent that Jesus does not want to have a conversation on who should be receiving the inheritance. Before we step into the text, we need to know and understand that this story comes to us as Jesus and the disciples are continuing their journey. There are thousands who have gathered. Even though there was a huge crowd that was gathered, Jesus' primary concern was his disciples. Yet, a demand came from the crowd. The younger brother did not even ask a question to Jesus. Instead, he came to Jesus with a demand. Jesus, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me. Now, there is law that clearly states what should happen. In Deuteronomy and Numbers, it is quite laid out clearly. In this circumstance, the older son should receive a double portion of the inheritance. Thus, the older brother would receive 2/3 of the inheritance, and the younger brother would receive 1/3 of the inheritance. However, Jesus does not want to deal with the inheritance demand. Now, I want you to know that the request or the demand is not unusual. It was extremely common in first century Palestine for Jews to ask rabbis for a ruling. The young man saw Jesus as a respected rabbi, thus the reason for addressing him as a teacher. When he calls Jesus a teacher, he acknowledges his authority to render a decision in this case. Instead of rendering a decision, Jesus gives him some advice, and then he gives the crowd some advice, and then he shares a parable. The parable is one that many of us are familiar with, although the majority of us may want to push the parable aside and then hope and pray that the preacher is too scared to preach a sermon on stewardship. But before we take an adventure into the parable, let's take a look at the advice that Jesus gives to the younger brother and to the crowd. To the younger brother, Mister, what makes you think that it's any of my business to judge or be a mediator for you? In this simple sentence, Jesus is challenging the young man to free himself from having a preoccupation with material cases. To the crowd, take care. Protect yourself against the least bit of greed. Life is not defined by what you have, even when you have a lot. Now, when Jesus said this, I do not believe that he is against us saving for our retirement or our future needs. I also don't think that God doesn't want us to eat, drink, and be merry and enjoy what God has given us. I think that we can take a look at the stories in the Bible and see that Jesus spent time eating and drinking with people and enjoying life. However, he did it with individuals, and he was also extremely clear about where his true security laid. Jesus then expands on greed by giving them the parable of a farmer who tore down the barns and built bigger barns. The parable is pretty explicit. Jesus tells the parable of the rich fool to teach against greed. Now, if you want me to boil it down to one sentence for you, I echo the words of Naveen Saras when she states that our secured life does not depend on our possessions, but on entrusting one's life to God. I want to encourage you to take some time and reread the story and notice these 4 components of the story. The number of times that the word I appears, the number of times the word my appears, the confident repetition of what he will do. In the story, there is no mention of God. So in this story, there is no one except him and his goods. For us, I think that the challenge is to live faithfully. We need to constantly take a look at our lifestyle and our financial choices while participating in the community that we live in and helping those in need. It seems like the man did not help or serve his communities. As Lutherans, we are called to serve all people, following the example of Jesus. This could come in many forms. Yes, it can come in the forms of treasures that we have, but it could also come in the form of time and our talents. When we take a look at greed, and I believe it comes in many forms that we can hang our hat on. The fact that we hold on to greed, it makes us worry about the future instead of trusting God, who holds on to the future. Greed destroys us. Generosity blesses us. So how can we lean in to generosity instead of greed? I am not sure if this will resonate with you or not, or if you can speak from personal experience. But like the rich farmer, many of us are tempted to think that having large amounts of money and possessions stored up will make us feel more secure. However, sooner or later, we learn that no amount of property or wealth can keep us secure. Then, more importantly, we realize that no matter how much we accumulate, the accumulation cannot keep our relationships healthy and our families from falling apart. I have not been with a family member or a church member who, at the end of their life, wished that they had stayed at work a little longer to make a little more money. Instead, they talk about that they wish that they would have spent more time where life really matters. Death has a way of clarifying what really matters. With the farmer, he ends up coming empty. On his last day, he has all that he believes he wants and more. Yet at the end, which comes that very night, it proves to be inadequate. Thus, when I stand back and I take a look at this story, I think that it is about priorities. It is about who is truly God in our lives. Is it the God of the universe, or is it the false gods that we try to fill our lives up with? In our Bible study on Tuesday, we reread the last verse a few times. Here it is in the NRSV that we use at church. So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich towards God. I shared with them that I think that language could be a little confusing, and I appreciate how Eugene Peterson translates it. Hear his translation and see if it helps. That's what happens when you fill your barn with self and not with God. We are able to be rich towards God and to set our minds on the things that are above because our old self has died and we have a new life in Jesus. Maybe if we fill our barns, our hearts with God, then we can have a different way to align our lives. When our focuses shift to God and others, then Our lives will be walking with God's mission to bless and redeem the world. Now, may you live as if that were the most true thing about you. Amen.